Alright, welcome everybody to another video tutorial in client-side web development. My name is Todd, and today we are building a simple page layout, an HTML5 document. And we're just going to go over a lot of the semantic elements that go into it, okay? And we're also going to be using some cool CSS properties that you may not have heard of, so that's going to be a neat thing. We are going to be using W3 School's editor because we can see changes in real time. It gives us a really good visual, excuse me, and a nice wide open space to view our changes. So when we first go into the editor, you can see they give us an initial template just to place some placeholder text in the body. We're going to get rid of that. But you can see they explicitly have this doc type declaration here, and of course it is an HTML document. This is used by the browsers just to render the page correctly and declare it as an HTML5 document. Okay, so that's an integral part of the setup process, so make sure you have that. Next, we have the HTML tags, which serve as the top, or yes, the top of the hierarchy or the document object model, or even referred to as the top of the node list. So when you're traversing the DOM, typically you're passing this tag because it wraps around all of the markup that you have. Okay, but we're actually going to go a step further, and we're going to add this language attribute, and we're going to set that to EN, or English for shorthand. The reason why we do that is there's a lot of screen reading technologies and other assistive technologies and locale technologies that do look at this attribute in order to translate the document properly. So it's important to set that. Okay. Next, we have our body tags. We're going to leave those in there. That's going to comprise the entire document. So everything you see on the right here in white is actually the body. And what we're going to start with is just creating some head tags. So head tags are pretty important because you have things like meta tags in there, and meta tags is sort of like descriptive data about the document. So we're going to have some meta tags. That we also have the title, or the tab titles. If you look up top here on the browser, W3 School's Try It Editor, these are what's called tab titles, and you can actually set that here in the head. Also, too, you would typically have things like script tags and links to style sheets or cascading style sheets, and other things like CDNs or scripts to other libraries, that sort of thing. But for now, we're just going to focus on some simple tags. Okay, so we'll start with a meta. This one is going to be the character set. We set the character set because that set includes all of our numbers 0 to 9, our alphabet A to Z, as well as all the punctuation that we know. What it does essentially is it tells the browser to render these characters properly, and this is a standard used throughout web development. So you see that meta tag everywhere. Next, we are going to examine a meta tag that perhaps you haven't seen before, and this deals with responsiveness. Okay. This one, we give it a name called viewport. So a viewport in the context of web development is, depending on the device or platform, it's all of the available space on the screen essentially. Okay, so when we're referring to a viewport, viewport height, viewport width, just think of the entire screen on many different devices that we're referring to, in which you can view web pages. Okay, there's a content attribute here, and we're going to set the value to this width equals device width. And what this does essentially allows for responsiveness of your web page on multiple different viewports. And as you can imagine, you have cell phones, you have tablets, you have desktop computers, all different sizes, and laptops as well. And so it's very important that we set this meta tag in all of our documents, okay, for responsiveness. The next one here, we're going to add a comma, and then we have this initial scale setting, and we set it to 1.0. Now what this does is initial scale is going to be 1. Typically, when you have a scale from 0 to 1, 1 means 100%, 0 is 0%. So we want the initial scale to be 1 of 1. So the true scale of the document. Okay. Next, we are going to set the tab title. Now this is nice and easy. And because we're setting up our first HTML document, I've set it up as sort of like a portfolio. We are web developers, so what we want to do typically is have some sort of portfolio with maybe our picture on it, with an about us, and maybe some links to other sections. But basically it's a simple landing page where people can find out more about you as a software developer, and that can include things like experience, what kind of technical expertise you have as far as maybe some development languages or some of the tools you use. Also maybe some links to projects or things like that. Okay, so you'll get really an idea of how things look once we get them set up and configured. Okay, so we've set the tab title, and if you run it, you won't see anything because we don't have actually any markup or front-end markup yet. Next, what we're going to do is we're going to make some space, and we're going to have an opening and closing style tag. Now, this is for cascading style sheet syntax, or CSS. Okay, CSS is a design language for our HTML. And there's a few different ways you can incorporate it into a document. Here we are using what's called embedded styling, where we just have it all in the head. But what happens is when you have more involved projects, you typically just use a link to your style sheet. And I'll just give you an example here. Actually, let's use a comment. So comments, the interpreter or the browser will just skip right over them. They won't actually run. What we're going to do is we are just going to type out the syntax for the link tag. Okay, and that's what it looks like. So if you had a link to an external style sheet. So when I say external, it's typically housed in a local file system or a file system on a server, that kind of thing. But that's what it would look like. And we have the href, so the hyperlink reference to the style sheet, and that could be a local file, it could be a local path or a URL. And then we also have this relation attribute, and what that means is how is this how is this linked item or document related to the HTML page, and in this case it's a style sheet. Okay, all right, so great, but in this project we are just using embedded, so that means all of our CSS selectors will be in between these two tags. Okay. All right, excuse me. So what we're going to do next is sort of set up our body. Okay, so our body is comprised in HTML5. It's comprised of a few different things. One is the header. The other is what we're going to use is nav for navigation, short for navigation. Okay. we're also going to be using an aside. So an aside is sort of like a supportive structure, usually to the right of the document, and it's not the main focal point of the document or the sheet. That's off to the right, giving some sort of supportive role to the page. Okay, and that could take the form of quotes or footnotes or any sort of supportive information that would help the main content of the page. Okay, and that brings us to our main div, or sorry, not div, but tag. So this is pretty self-explanatory. That's where our main content goes. And I put that in front of the aside or on top of it in this case. What I do want to do is once you start getting all these nested elements or elements inside things like bodies or other divs, you really want to start indenting them. And a great way is just to highlight everything and press tab. Okay, because it sets it apart from, say, the body. And our eyes thank us for it because it's easier to read. And so once you get more nested elements, you do want to tab them out accordingly, and you'll see that as we go along. Okay. All right, we're not done yet. Right after the header, what we're going to do is actually put a div. We're going to use a div. So div, you can view it as a division. It's a division on the page, and really, it's really how you define it. What kind of gives it a uniqueness about it is the attributes themselves. So if we create a div, and divs have a few different attributes. We can use an ID attribute for a unique element that's usually singular. Well, that is singular. What that means is you typically only have one of them. And if you have more than one div, that's when you would use a class, what's called a class attribute. Okay. So in this case, we're going to use the ID of container, and anything we want inside of this container, we're going to wrap it. Okay, so the closing div is going to be right here. Okay, which means this container is encapsulating these three child elements or descendants, the nav, the main, and the aside. Okay. All right, so that is the basic setup that we have. So we're doing good. If you run it again, you're not going to see anything, just because, excuse me, we have actually no content. We just have the structure of the page. Now, if you inspected the document, say if you hit F12, because it's in this container here, this W3 Schools container, you might not be able to see it. But if it were in production or in actual browser, you could F12 or right-click Inspect in the DevTools and go to Elements, and you would see all of this markup, despite it being a blank page. Okay. All right, so what we can do now is actually add CSS, which gives us not only design, but dimensions. Right now, we just have the tags, but they have no dimensions in this 2D space. CSS allows us to give it a height and width dimension to fill up space. Also, things like properties like background color, font color, pattern, margin, that kind of thing. So that's what we're going to do next. So we're going to head up into the style section. And what we're going to do first is just explain what a selector is. So a selector is a CSS selector is basically it basically targets the element on the page respectively. Okay. So if I wanted to target the main, I would simply type in main. If I wanted to target a div with an ID, I would use the hashtag. If it were a class, I would prefix this container word with a period. So it really depends on the element that you're targeting. That kind of determines the selector. Okay, and what you see up here actually is a special kind of selector. And this is an asterisk, so you would have to Shift 8 on your keyboard. And what this does is actually selects the root of the document. And by root, I mean really the root. So the what I need to explain is basically the browser that you have will actually have preset CSS styles, okay? And this is for just some initial styling, but when we're developing a web page, we actually want to set these things to 0 or reset them, okay? So resetting default browser styles by using this asterisk or this root selector, okay? And then we go on to reset things like margin. Okay, so spacing around elements we want to set to 0. Also padding, so spacing inside elements we want to set to 0. And then finally we're going to, we are going to use a property called box sizing. Okay, so box sizing we are going to set to border box. And what this means essentially, and I'll try and just open up a DevTools because usually you can find one here, right here. Okay, so just make sure you run the code after you put in the border box. What this means, and if you hit the DevTools, you go into Elements, this is kind of hidden away, so you might have to expand it. But what this means with border box is if I have a box like this that is 100 pixels height by 100 pixels width, if I add margin, if I add padding or border, excuse me, what this means is it will still maintain that 100 pixels by 100 pixels dimension, and the margin and the border and the padding will actually be built in to the element, if that makes sense. Okay, so if we didn't have border box, there could be cases where if we add margin, this actually increases the overall height and width. It goes from 100 by 100 to maybe 150 by 150 because you added 50 pixels of margin all around. Okay, with border box, even if you add padding and border and margin, that's still going to maintain its dimensions. Okay, and that's important because when you're affecting changes on padding and margin on a bunch of different elements on the page, that tends to overflow things. Okay, that tends to overflow containers, the page itself, and it leads to scroll situations that are undesirable. Okay, and what I mean by that is these scroll bars you'll have horizontally, vertically, and in cases where you just want the screen to snap to the dimensions with no scroll bar at all. Okay. All right. So the next part here is we are going to actually do what's called chaining in CSS. So chaining is where you actually take two elements and chain them so you can apply CSS styling to both or two or more. Okay. In this case, we are going to do it to body and HTML. Okay, and what this does is basically we're selecting both elements on the page. And why we're doing that is because we're setting the height of both to 100%. And you might be asking, well, 100% of what? And that goes back to the viewport. So it's going to be 100% of the available height of the viewport or within the browser. Okay, so we set both of those elements to 100% of the height, and we are good. Okay. What this does basically is we don't have any conditions where the body stops short or the of the actual page itself, and then you get some gaps or things like that, okay? All right, next we are actually affecting the header. So the header typically is where you have things like logos or banners, or you can have navigation or search bars or things like that. If we look at this document here, the header is right here, right above all the all this menu stuff. And there's nothing in it, but it's just because this is an editor and they don't want to distract you with a bunch of stuff. Okay, but typically you would have a lot of things just over the main, hanging over the main content. Okay, and as you can see, you might be wondering, well, what am I doing with all this kind of indentation and stuff? So with CSS, it's good to kind of maintain the indentation on both, well, the properties themselves, and properties I mean margin, padding, box sizing, or height, and so on, just for readability's sake. So you have the actual selectors on the left here, and then maybe you want to tab in or space it out a little bit, but just make sure these properties line up because it's easier to read. Okay, we're actually going to set the background of this header to orange so we can see it. We're going to give it dimensions, a height of 100 pixels, so that explicit height, and we're just going to set the width to 100% of the width on the page. Okay, and if you run that, excuse me, we now have our header. Okay, so you can actually go into the HTML markup now and explain that this is a header. This is an example, rather, of a header. Okay, perfect. All right, so we're starting to see things take shape, which is great. Next element on the list, and we're kind of going logically here, is this container. So this container is going to work a little bit differently. So far we've been using tags, and we've used the root with the asterisks and things like the semantic labels like header, body, HTML, and so on. But now we're trying to target this div. So divs are very general. They can be anything. In this case, it's a container with an ID. So in order to select an ID, we actually have to prefix it with a pound or a hashtag. Okay, and that is Shift-3 for me on my keyboard. But that's how we select this element. If it were a class, so say if I had a class container, I would change this to a period. Okay. But since it's an ID, I'm just going to hit Control-Z and revert my change back and get rid of that extra attribute there, okay, because it's an ID. Okay, so this is something very special. We are actually going to use what's called a flex, a display flex property. And I have to go over display in general first with you. So basically what happens in HTML is when you place an element on the page, it starts initially at the leftmost side, so here where my cursor is, and it will stack these elements vertically down until it reaches the bottom, and then it will go into a new column, and so on and so on. Okay, so that's what's called a block property, or display block. So by default, HTML will display block, okay, unless you change it explicitly to something like flex. So a flex box is exactly that. So basically, you have a flex box container, which we're setting up here. It means that all of these child elements or the descendants like nav, main, aside, these will flex respectively inside this container. So there are additional settings we have to set for this to work. So we have to, for instance, set explicit dimensions or flex dimensions for some elements here. But just remember, it's important to remember that once you set it to flex, the items inside any sort of container set to flex will flex. So that means expand or contract inside that container, okay, or in that flex box. And I'm trying to get this to increase here so I can illustrate that. Usually there is a, there we go. So I just had to zoom out. You might have to zoom in or zoom out of the document just to see that scrolling, okay. So once we have dimensions to these flex children right here, and we add some colors, you will start to see them flex as we expand and contract the viewport, okay. All right, so the container is great. Next is what happens if I set the background to this container, for instance, and we just put, let's put gray, okay. First of all, there's no height dimension. So let's, for instance, put it at 400. But what you notice is this height is actually being stuffed underneath the header, okay? So if I were to remove the header, so let's try this. If you just remove that header, just cut it out and run it, you'll notice that the container itself actually is stuffed underneath that header, okay? And we don't want that. So we have a way in CSS to actually avoid that situation and have a container like that basically fill out the rest of the available space underneath the header, so things are done properly, okay? And that's, we're actually going to get rid of this background because that was for illustration. Okay, and just run that. But we're going to get rid of this explicit 400, and we're going to set the value to sort of a function. So there's what's called a calc function in CSS, and this is used quite a bit everywhere. What it does is basically it calculates dynamically a property so we can get a desired output. In this case, we want to calculate a height that takes into account this header that we've set a height to as 100 pixels, and we actually want to start after the header. So we want to start this container after this header starts. So how do we do that? Well, we set the height initially to 100 pixels, but we also want to calculate a reduction, well, we want to calculate a start, if you will, of 100 pixels. So what that does is it gives that 100 pixel gap where the header is, so we've set it to 100 pixels up here, and then starts the container. So what that should do is set up the container right underneath the header. So if you run that, you won't see anything unless you add a background. So let's do that real quick. All right, so now the container starts right after the header, exactly 100 pixels after. And so if you were to change the height of the header, you would also have to change the calculation here accordingly, okay? But if you actually cut out the header now and run it, oh, excuse me, it's still, sorry, it's still going to, the container is still going to kind of collapse up, but you can see there's 100 pixels worth of space below it that would normally be occupied by the header up top. Okay, so I'm just going to Control Z and run it just to get our header back. And sorry, I should explain. Control Z is a way to revert your changes. So there's certain shortcuts that you can make. And believe you me, you do make a lot of mistakes when you're developing. So Control Z is just a fast way to revert any changes. Say if I were to delete these main tags, I hit Control Z, well, they're right back where they came from. Excuse me, or where they started rather. And Control Z is just a great way to revert any mistakes that you've made, or if you need to go back. So A lot of editors or text editors and IDEs or integrated development environments will have the revert button, usually at the top here, but not in W3 Schools. We just use the hotkey or the shortcut. Okay. Another great shortcut is Control C, so that's copy. So we do a lot of copying, just duplicating things, and then we want to paste them. So we use what's the hotkey Control V to paste, rather than right-click, copy, right-click, paste. It's just Control C, Control V. Okay. So try to add that into your everyday development routine, and things will go a lot quicker for you. Okay, next, after the container, and we're kind of going from the top down here. Actually, let's just look at it. We have our nav. Okay, so we're actually going to do another chaining. So I'm going to start with the nav selector, but we're also going to add the aside. Okay, so the nav and the aside are similar, but the nav occupies the left side typically, and the aside will typically occupy the right side. It's not set in stone, but that's kind of convention. And at least in this basic setup, just know that navigation menus can span horizontally. They could really be anywhere you like, but a lot of times when you visit a web page, it will be laid out like that. Okay. All right. So if you recall, these are the child elements of the container. Okay. The container itself is a flex box because we set this to display to flex. So what we need to do now, because these are child or descendant elements, is now we need to kind of dynamically control the flex properties of these child elements. And we can do that with what's called a flex property. Okay. And the flex property takes a bunch of different values. Right now, all we're focused on is the the width value. So we set initially the initial value and the height value to 0, and we want to set the width to 20%. Okay, what that does is say, okay, at 100% viewport width, this nav and this aside are going to occupy 20% of the width respectively. So 40% in total of the page. And that will change, of course, when you expand and contract the document. But when the viewport's 100%, though, that's the width. Okay. All right, and it's in a percent and not an explicit pixel or something like that. And this makes it responsive, truly responsive. So we're going to set the background to this, to both items, as blue. Okay, so we're going to run that. And you can see here that we have this blue kind of square, a rectangle. I would call it a square. All right, so what this is showing you essentially is the nav and the aside together inside of a flex box. But what we really want is this main where our content's going to be filling out the inside. So these are two separate elements. It's just because we have nothing inside the main, or we have no dimensions in the main, that they're collapsed in on each other. Okay, but because the main is right in the middle, once we add some sort of dimension or flex property, that main will take shape. Okay, and that's what we're going to do next. So let's target the main here, the main selector, and we're also going to use this flex property, but we're going to set the value simply to 1. And what this means is because nav and the aside occupy 20% each, or 40% on the whole, this main set to 1 is going to occupy the rest of the width, which is 60% of the width. Okay, that's what that means. So in order to visualize that, we are going to set a background to red. Okay, and we're also going to set some padding up. to give it some, because it doesn't have any content now, we are going to give it some padding of 10 px. And once we run this, we do see a little bit of content there, but nothing close to 60%. So what we need to do is now, oh, sorry. I added a comma after flex, that should be a semicolon, and run that. That's why it wasn't running. And now you can see this main content area is 60% of the width, or thereabouts, and just because it really needs to be 100%. And it's responsive. That's a big key, but you can see the aside, which is on the right side, and the nav on the left, as well as the main. These all flex accordingly, with the main being the focal point, okay, because that's where your main content is going to be. Okay, great. So we actually have most of our CSS laid out. What we can do now is just add some descriptions here, or descriptive text, saying this is a navigation area. We can go down to main and say this is the main content area. And then we can also go to the aside and say this is the aside area. Okay, and run that. All right. And now you can see we're really starting to section off our web page, and it's already responsive before we even put any sort of detail onto the page, which is great. That's really where you want to start first. Excuse me. Okay, but we're not done, because as with any website, you typically have a footer, and where we're going to place that in our markup is just right underneath the closing tag of the container. So right before the body closing tag and right after the closing div tag for the container, we are going to put a footer here, like so. Okay, and all we need to do here, and we can just put in our comment, this is the footer area. And if you run that, it kind of gives it a footer area, but not a true one. So what we're going to do is we're going to go into our CSS and have a footer selector. We are going to give it a background of, what's a color we haven't used? Let's go gray. We've used gray, but there's no gray on the screen except over the behind the text there. And we're going to give it a height of 50 pixels, not too big. Okay. All right, and that's it. So the footer again is where you typically would have your contact us, your privacy agreements, your terms of service for your website, all your socials to Facebook, Instagram, WeChat, whatever you use, and you would have that here. Okay, so here we have navigation, here we have main content, the aside, and the header. And as sort of the final piece here, because we really just wanted to focus on layout, what we're going to do is we are going to kind of add a sort of a logo, but it's going to be a text logo. Okay, so we're going to actually use an H1 header. So H1s are heading, text headings. And the H1 variant happens to be the largest one. It goes all the way to H6, and H6 being the smallest and H1 being the largest. And we use H1 here because we want a big, nice big heading. And we're going to go my portfolio page, and type in my portfolio page. I'm going to run that, and there we go. Perfect, nice and big on the page there. And you can notice it's kind of clinging to the edges there. So what we can do here is use a selector, in this case H1, to add some styling or padding or margin. Okay, but please note, if you have more than one H1, which you typically do on a document, If you select it like this, then it will style all the H1s like this. But if you just want to target this individual H1, you can give it an ID. Okay. In this case, we can just give it a logo ID. Okay. And then instead of using that H1, which is general, we can use a more specific selector, and we can go give it some padding because it's inside the header right now. And we're going to just go 15 pixels. Perfect. All right. So that's great. That's perfect. So everything looks great so far. There's one thing I do want, one last thing I want to do is in the navigation area, I actually want to set up links or anchor tags to kind of finish off this video tutorial. So to do that, we do have to go into the nav. And what we're going to do is just get rid of that placeholder content, and we are now going to place some markup. And this is perhaps markup you've never seen before. This stands for unordered lists. So there's many kind of lists you can look at in HTML. One is a numbered list, 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on. The other is an alphabetical list, so A to Z. An unordered list gives you bullet points. So you see them everywhere. You have a bunch of list items, and then they're prefixed, or they have a bullet point right in front of the list item. And they're just a great way to organize lists. And also, you do it all the time with output from arrays and things in JavaScript and databases. But here we're going to use it for navigation, which is pretty common. Okay, so we have the nav, the UL, and we have this tag called list. Okay, so these are actually the list items, and we're going to tab those out, and you can see our page is looking pretty organized just because we're using indentation and everything is lined up pretty good. So I'm happy about that. Inside these list items, I'm actually going to have anchor tags. So we have the hypertext reference attribute, or href, and we're going to set this to the pound symbol, just because all that does, it's a dummy link. So when you actually click on it, it does nothing. Okay, because we don't want to actually send it to another page. We just want to have that link to look at for now. Okay, so we have a closing anchor tag, and then inside these is actually the link title, or the text, in other words, or the anchor text. And here we're just going to go link 1. Okay, and if you run that, you can actually see there's link 1. And what we're going to do is copy this now and paste it. It looks like 7 times over. And we're just going to line them up. That's just, I just hit Control C for copy and Control V for paste, and I kind of just outputted it there, but I want them all nice in a row. And next I'm going to change the link titles, or the title, to the respective numbers, and then I'm just going to run that, and now you're starting to see these links up here. But list items do have bullet points in front of them. We just can't see them because they're behind this bar here. But what we're going to do is actually add some padding or spacing. Okay. All right. So if you click on them, they won't actually do anything, just because we've set the value to pretty much null. Okay. All right. But now we want to space these out. So how do we do that? This brings us to an interesting concept, and that's just nesting, or nested elements. So we've talked about the DOM, or the document object model, before, and how you have to kind of traverse the DOM in order to find these elements. And when you really start nesting things, what happens is you have to be specific to the selector in order for the interpreter or the browser to understand where you want the CSS applied. Okay, in some cases, if you don't have an explicit reference, it will not apply the styling to the desired element because it simply cannot find it. Okay, so we have to provide what's called context. Okay, so in this case, if I want to target this list item, which has our links or anchor tags, then I actually have to go UL and then LI for list items. Okay, I may be able to get away with just LI, but I do want to provide the contextual selector in order for these things to be found. Otherwise, and oftentimes, and I encounter this, it just won't be applied because it cannot find it. And it's okay, and this is a pretty simplistic example, but when you really have production code where there's hundreds, if not thousands of lines of code and markup and styling, and these nested elements become really intricate, you have to provide these contextual selectors, otherwise they won't get applied. Okay, so what we're going to do here is actually just provide some margin. So I'm going to set this margin to 25 and see where that gets us. Okay, there we are. So the margin did work. We now see the bullet points and we all see the links. So you can imagine or visualize in your head, these links would just be to other pages like maybe contact us or about us or maybe to projects or things like that. But we're going to leave everything as is. This is a great intro into how to set up a responsive website that looks good right out the gate, and how we kind of configure the page to lay the groundwork for a truly amazing web page or document. Okay, so I hope that was interesting and intriguing for you, and you learned a lot. Thanks for listening and watching. I'm Todd Nash, and I will see you next time. Thank you very much.